May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. My sermon this morning needs to begin with a little disclaimer, which is that my blonde-headed spouse has given her permission for use of this particular sermon illustration on this morning only. So 3 blondes arrive at the heavenly gate. And St. Peter says to them, if you can answer one question, I will let you into the kingdom of heaven. And St. Peter says, what is Easter? First blonde says, I know. Easter's that holiday in the fall when we bake a turkey and we eat lots of food and we watch football and we give thanks. Peter says, no, I don't think so. Second blonde says, I know. Easter is that holiday when we decorate our houses and our trees and we sing all those carols and we give each other presents. Peter says, no, I'm really sorry, that's not it. The third blonde says, well, Easter actually begins 3 days before, when Jesus gathered his disciples together and they shared a meal that they called the Last Supper. And Peter's going, yeah. And then the next day, Jesus was betrayed and crucified and hung on the cross and died. And Peter's like, yes, exactly. She says, and he laid in the tomb for 3 days. And on the morning of the 3rd day, the boulder was rolled away from the tomb. Jesus stuck his head out, and because he saw his shadow, he went back in and said there were 6 more weeks of winter. Now, it's not just a bad Easter joke. Because in the Orthodox Church, the day after Easter, which for them is actually a week from now, is called the Day of Joy and Laughter. And it's a day when families would get together and they would cook a big meal and they would share time with their family and friends and they would sit around during the day telling jokes. And the reason they told jokes is because in the Orthodox Church, the resurrection is the biggest joke of all. The power of evil was really sure it had won. And just when the power of evil was ready to celebrate its victory, God pulled the biggest joke of all in the resurrection of Jesus. And if you think about Jesus' life, Jesus' whole life from the time he was born was really a battle between good and evil, between the power of death and the power of life. I mean, it starts when Jesus was a small child and Herod waylays the 3 kings and says to them, tell me when you find the Christ child, I'd like to worship him too. And because of Herod, the Holy Family is forced to flee to Egypt. And Herod kills all of the baby boys under the age of 2 in the hopes of destroying the infant Jesus. And when the power of death thought perhaps it had won, the power of life had prevailed. Throughout Jesus' ministry, we hear stories of these conflicts. When Jesus was baptized, he comes up out of the water and the heavens open, and the voice of God says, this is my beloved Son on whom my favor rests. And what happens next? Jesus is driven into the desert and tempted by the devil. The power of evil and the power of life. As Jesus wandered, teaching and preaching and sharing the good news, he was constantly attacked. Those in power were always trying to find the ways to make him betray himself, to get him into their grasp, to punish him. And Jesus slips through their hands over and over and over again. Sometimes just by sliding away. Other times by saying things like, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and unto God's that which is God's, and sort of sending his opponents slinking away. But there is a constant battle through his life of the power of death and the power of life. And I'm sure that that power of death and power of evil thought it had won when Judas came to the temple authorities and said, I will betray Jesus into your hands. I imagine that the power of evil at that point was doing a little happy dance. They got off cheap, just 30 pieces of silver. And indeed, Jesus was betrayed, scourged, beaten, humiliated, shamed, hung on the cross. And the power of evil was sure it had won, especially when Jesus' body was put in the tomb and that stone was rolled in front. And the power of evil thought, this is it. The world is now mine. There is nothing more to stand in my way. And yet there was. And just when the power of evil thought it had won, the power of God raised Jesus from the dead and drove the power of evil away again. That's not just a story that happened 2,000 years ago. Because when we speak words in our worship, we don't say Christ was raised from the dead. We don't say Christ was raised 2,000 years ago. We started our service this morning saying Christ is risen. Present tense. Christ is risen. It wasn't just something that happened and then never happened again. It's something that happens over and over and over and over again. In us and through us and because of us. And I don't know about you, but it's really easy for me to think some days that the power of evil really has won. There are days that seem pretty dark. And in fact, a friend of mine said to me this week, I'm not going to go to church on Good Friday. I'm going to sit home with the newspaper and pray the Stations of the Cross with the stories I find there. Because the newspaper is full of oppression and despair and darkness and death. She said, I don't need to come to church and walk through the church. It's present right here and right now. But that's why Christ is risen is so important. Because the power of life and the power of God always has the last word. Even when we think we've hit the darkest of the dark. Even when we think we're sure that evil has won. Over and over again we say Christ is risen. That the power of life and the power of God flows through us and in us and with us. Because indeed the power of evil would have won if we ever said Christ was risen. Because that would have meant that it was a done deal and it didn't happen again. But that's not it. Christ is risen. Christ is risen today. Christ will be risen tomorrow. Christ is risen in you, and Christ is risen in me. And so ultimately our message is the power of God and the power of life prevails. Amen.